They kicked him out on a cold night, saying he was no longer their son. 12 years later, what he did shocked everyone. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The night had fallen like a heavy curtain over the quiet northern city, its streets submerged under blankets of thick, unrelenting snow. In the dim glow of the street lamps, the white flakes danced and twisted, forming drifts that crept up against parked cars, doorsteps, and the bases of bare trees. Minneapolis was no stranger to winter's wrath, but that evening was crueler than most. The air held a stillness that seemed unnatural, as if even the wind had retreated into silence. Christmas lights blinked weakly behind frosted windows, their cheer muted by the storm. In one modest neighborhood where houses sat close together like tired shoulders huddled against the cold, a scene unfolded inside a run-down two-story home that would alter the course of a young boy's life forever. Michael sat on the floor in the small bedroom he shared with his older brother, although the bed on the other side had been empty for months now. His brother had run off at 17 and never looked back. The absence still hung in the room, like dust that never quite settled. Michael was now 14, thin from growing too fast and eating too little, with skin the color of polished mahogany and deep-set eyes that held more silence than a boy his age should carry. He clutched a worn paperback novel in his lap, something he'd borrowed from the school library, a biography of Thurgood Marshall. He hadn't even made it halfway through before the shouting started downstairs. The walls of the house were paper-thin. Every word exchanged below echoed through the cracked drywall like thunder. His father's voice was unmistakable, thick, hoarse, soaked with alcohol and bitterness. It started with a complaint about dinner, then swerved into a tirade about the heating bill before, inevitably, it turned to him. Michael. The disappointment. The burden. The unwanted mouth to feed. Michael didn't move at first. He kept his eyes on the page, pretending he could block it out, pretending the words could keep him safe. But the footsteps came stomping up the stairs, heavy and uneven. Then the door flew open so violently it knocked into the wall, the knob leaving another dent beside the one already there. His father filled the doorway, a large man with a belly straining against a stained tank top, eyes bloodshot and hands trembling, not from cold, but from fury. "You still sitting there like you don't hear me?" the man growled. Michael set the book aside and stood up, not speaking. His mouth was dry. His heart thudded in his chest, but he did not run. "You think you're better than the rest of us, don't you? Always reading, always acting like you got some big plan. You ain't special. You're a mouth we can't afford." Michael opened his mouth to explain. He wasn't trying to act special. He just wanted quiet, to learn, to escape. But the words never came. They never did. "Get your things. You're out." The boy blinked, thinking he'd misheard. His father staggered toward him, grabbed the small duffel bag from the corner of the room, and threw it onto the bed. "You heard me. Out. Now." From downstairs came the muffled sound of his mother's voice. Not a protest, just a quiet, weary mutter. She wasn't coming to stop it. She hadn't stopped anything in years. "I didn't even do anything," Michael whispered. "That's the problem," his father snapped. "You do nothing but take and mope and suck the heat out of this place. Ain't got room for dead weight. You're always staring at me like I'm the villain. You don't like it here? Good. Go freeze your fancy thoughts outside." Michael stood still as his father grabbed his thin winter coat and thrust it into his chest. He could see spit in the corner of his father's mouth, smell the stale whiskey on his breath. Then the man turned and stomped down the stairs, bellowing, "You got 10 seconds before I throw your skinny ass out myself." Michael moved quickly, stuffing a pair of gloves, his school binder, and the biography into the duffel bag. He hesitated at the window, looking at the snow swirling outside. The wind howled like something alive. When he made it to the front door, his father was already there, holding it open, the night air rushing in like a punishment. His mother stood in the kitchen, arms crossed, eyes averted. She wouldn't even meet his gaze. That, more than the cold, pierced his chest. His father shoved the duffel at him one last time, muttered, "Don't come back knocking," and slammed the door shut behind him. Michael stood on the porch in disbelief. The snow soaked into his shoes immediately. He had no plan, no destination, only the echo of the door and the sharp bite of the wind. He hugged himself tightly, his breath turning into clouds in front of him. The house behind him was dark now. Not a single curtain twitched. He trudged to the sidewalk and turned left, walking aimlessly past homes glowing with warmth he could no longer claim. Through the windows he saw families gathered around dinners, laughing, celebrating, sharing food. Christmas Eve. Of course it was. That made it all the more bitter. He was a boy abandoned on the night the world celebrated love and unity. Every few blocks he stopped to catch his breath, curling his gloved hands into fists, trying to stop the burning sting of numb fingers. His coat was too thin. His socks were damp. He thought of the times he'd complained about cold mornings on the way to school. How foolish that seemed now. At the edge of the neighborhood, near an old strip mall, he found a bus stop shelter with 3 walls and a bench. It wasn't warm, but it was better than standing in the open. He sat down and pulled his legs to his chest, curling into himself like a question mark. The street lights above cast a hazy yellow circle that flickered whenever the wind blew too hard. He pulled the book out of his bag, trying to read by the light, but his hands shook too badly. He stuffed it back inside and lay down on the bench, using the duffel as a pillow. The metal was cold against his side. He closed his eyes and thought of school, of the few teachers who had ever shown him kindness. He thought of the small library, of Mrs. Ellison, who always let him stay late when he said he needed a quiet place. He wondered if anyone would notice he was gone. Sleep came in broken pieces, invaded by dreams of warmth he could no longer feel. In one, his father opened the door and welcomed him back inside. In another, he was older, successful, walking past the house he once called home with a coat so heavy and rich it could never be penetrated by snow. By morning, the city was even quieter. He woke to find a thin layer of snow had dusted his coat and hair. He brushed it off and sat up, his stomach hollow. A man walked by with a paper cup of coffee and didn't look at him. A woman hurried by with a grocery bag, glancing at him only once before averting her eyes. Invisible. That's what he had become. He stood up and began walking again. The day was just beginning, and he had nowhere to be. He wandered into a gas station, lingering near the snack aisle, waiting until the clerk was distracted, then slipped a granola bar into his pocket and left. His heart pounded the whole way down the street. It would become a routine soon, but for now it was just the first full day of being nothing. He kept moving, because standing still meant freezing, and freezing meant stopping, and stopping meant giving up. Michael wasn't ready to give up yet. The first morning after Michael was cast out of his home felt like a dream dulled by hunger and cold. He walked for hours without direction, guided only by the instinct to stay moving. Each breath left a cloud of vapor hanging in the air, vanishing almost instantly into the frigid wind. The snow had slowed, but the cold had not relented. His shoes, soaked through, squelched with every step. His legs ached, and his fingers burned, then numbed. The streets were mostly quiet. It was Christmas Day, and families were indoors, gathered around trees and television screens. The world was celebrating, but Michael walked unseen through the margins of it. He wandered past neighborhoods of brick houses and glowing windows where laughter floated faintly through the glass. Occasionally, he paused and watched the silhouettes inside. Parents carrying trays of food, children tearing into presents, dogs barking with excitement. It was a life that seemed impossibly distant. He moved on before the weight of it pulled him down. The city center was less festive. Most businesses were closed. Storefronts displayed Christmas sales behind locked doors, and the few people outside were hurrying to or from relatives' homes. No one noticed the shivering boy hugging a duffel bag to his chest. He kept to the edges of buildings, sometimes ducking into alleys to avoid eye contact. Around noon, the clouds broke just long enough for a thin band of sunlight to wash over the frozen sidewalks. Michael squatted in a corner near a closed cafe, letting the sun hit his face, his eyes shut tightly against the glare. The warmth lasted only a few minutes, but he stored it like a memory. That night, he returned to the bus stop shelter, now his temporary home. He curled up on the same bench, but sleep came harder than the night before. Hunger gnawed at his stomach. The granola bar had long been eaten. The cold reached deeper now, settling into his bones. He turned on his side and pulled his arms into his coat. The city was quieter than ever, as though it had forgotten he existed. Over the next few days, Michael learned the patterns of the street. He discovered which convenience stores had blind spots in their surveillance, which doors stayed unlocked after hours, and which alleyways remained dry even when the snow melted slightly. He began to keep a mental map of garbage bins that offered edible scraps. Dumpsters behind bakeries and restaurants became treasure troves in the early mornings. He learned how to wrap his feet in plastic bags to keep them dry, and found cardboard to sleep on that provided just enough barrier between his body and the frozen ground. He was not the only one living in the city's cracks. On the third night, as he sat huddled behind a supermarket loading dock, an older teen approached him carrying a plastic bag filled with dented canned goods and half-eaten sandwiches. The boy's name was Quincy. He was 17, wiry, with a buzz cut and dark circles under his eyes. He didn't ask Michael many questions. He simply dropped a sandwich near him and said, "Don't get caught in the wrong places, kid. Cops here don't care how cold it is." They didn't become friends. Trust didn't come easily on the streets, but there was a silent understanding between them. They shared warmth when they found it, guarded each other when they slept, and occasionally split what little food they had. Quincy had been out there longer. He warned Michael which shelters were full of thieves, which corners were patrolled too often, and which volunteers could actually be trusted. Even with Quincy's guidance, the nights remained brutal. One evening, while trying to sleep behind a broken billboard frame, Michael heard footsteps crunching on the snow. A man with a thin face and wild eyes approached, muttering to himself. Michael shrank into the shadows, heart racing. The man shouted something incoherent and kicked the nearby trash bin before stumbling away. That was the first night Michael didn't sleep at all. The loneliness grew heavy in the quiet moments. During the days, he wandered through the library downtown, pretending to read just to stay inside. The librarians gave him wary looks, but they never asked him to leave. He sat for hours, flipping through pages of books he barely registered, only pretending to study when, in truth, he was too tired to absorb anything. But sometimes, when he was able to focus, the words on the pages became an escape. History books, biographies, even textbooks, he read them all. He found particular solace in the lives of people who had started with nothing and built something. He saw himself in those stories, in the young men who had been underestimated, abandoned, and still rose above it. He thought often of his family, though he tried not to. The sting of being discarded, of watching the door close behind him, lived in his chest like a buried ember. He remembered the way his mother wouldn't look at him, how her silence hurt more than his father's shouting. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the erasure, as though he had never been there at all. One night, after 3 weeks on the street, Quincy disappeared. He had said he was going to try sneaking into a shelter near Lake Street that had space for older teens. He never came back. Michael waited for 3 nights, but the boy was simply gone. He had no way of knowing what had happened. Maybe he'd found a bed, or maybe he'd been caught, or maybe the streets had finally taken him. Michael found himself alone again. The cold seemed worse without the comfort of another breathing body nearby. He moved to a new spot near a subway entrance downtown, where the vents blew out warm air from beneath the station. It wasn't much, but it kept his face from freezing overnight. One morning, a woman in a red coat dropped a scarf beside him without a word. He stared after her as she disappeared into the crowd. He wrapped the scarf around his neck and felt, for the first time in days, something like gratitude. Still, things were getting worse. His gloves were wearing thin. His lips were cracked and bleeding. The dull ache in his legs had become a sharp pain that throbbed when he walked too far. He couldn't remember the last time he had a full meal. One afternoon, he tried to steal a loaf of bread from a small grocery store. He thought he was quick, but the owner saw him. The man grabbed him roughly by the collar and shook him, shouting into his face, threatening to call the police. Michael begged him not to. Something in his eyes must have reached the man because he eventually let go with a grunt and said, "Get lost." Michael ran until his lungs burned. He ended up in an alley behind a laundromat where he collapsed on a pile of wet cardboard and cried. The tears froze on his cheeks before they could reach his jaw. That was the lowest point. He didn't know how much longer he could survive. 2 months had passed since the night he was thrown out. February had arrived, colder and crueler than December ever was. His strength was waning. He spent more time curled into himself and less time walking. His face grew pale, his limbs heavy. People passed him without acknowledgement, just another shadow in the landscape of the forgotten. One evening, as dusk fell over the city, Michael dragged himself to the Nicollet Mall subway station. He made it as far as the entrance before his legs gave out. He slumped against the wall near the stairs, his breath shallow and erratic. Pedestrians walked around him without slowing. His vision blurred. The noise of the street became distant, like echoes down a long tunnel, and then a voice, calm, concerned. "Hey, are you okay?" Michael tried to lift his head but couldn't. He heard the voice again, closer now, and hands gently touching his arm, shaking him. Someone calling for help. Warmth, artificial but real, wrapped around him as a coat was placed over his shoulders. He slipped into unconsciousness with the faintest hope flickering inside him, barely a flame. For the first time in weeks, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he hadn't been completely erased from the world. When Michael opened his eyes, the world was no longer cold. It wasn't warm exactly, but the biting freeze that had lived in his bones for weeks was gone. Instead, there was a soft weight of blankets, the sterile smell of disinfectant, and a faint mechanical hum in the background. The ceiling above him was white with water stains in the corners. He blinked slowly, disoriented. His body ached, his limbs felt foreign, and his mouth was painfully dry. A clear plastic tube taped to his arm told him he was in a hospital. A nurse noticed he was awake and came to check on him. She spoke gently, her tone professional, not motherly, but not unkind either. He tried to speak, but his throat barely worked. She offered him water, then told him he had been found unconscious at the Nicollet Mall subway entrance 2 nights ago. A volunteer had seen him collapse and called for help. Michael nodded weakly. That was all he could do. They kept him for 2 days. He had mild frostbite on 2 fingers, borderline hypothermia, and a chest cold that hadn't yet turned into pneumonia but threatened to. He ate everything they gave him and more. He didn't talk much, no one asked many questions, and he didn't volunteer details. Eventually, a caseworker came to see him, a woman named Leanne who worked for the city's youth services department. She asked him his name, his age, whether he had a place to stay. He told her the truth, that he'd been on the street since Christmas, that he had no home, no family he could go back to. She didn't press for more. She just nodded, scribbled something in a folder, and said they would place him in a shelter on Lake Street once he was released. The shelter was not a house, not in the way people imagined homes to be. It was a repurposed brick building near an old church with frosted windows and a faded sign above the entrance that read, Mercy House for Youth. Inside, the air was warm and stale, filled with the scent of laundry detergent and the sharp tang of cafeteria food. Dozens of bunk beds filled 2 large rooms, and the common area held mismatched couches, board games with missing pieces, and a small television that only got local channels. It wasn't perfect, but it was safe, and for the first time in months, Michael had a bed that was only his. The first few nights, he didn't sleep well. The sounds of other boys breathing, whispering, snoring, or shifting in their beds made him nervous. He kept one hand on his duffel bag, though it held nothing anyone would want. The lights went out at 9, and the staff made rounds every hour. It was strange to feel watched and protected at the same time. He wasn't sure he liked it. But the staff didn't yell. They didn't grab him. They didn't lie. That was something. He spent the days mostly in silence. The other boys were older, louder, more confident. Some were angry, others numb. Michael watched them from a distance. A few tried to talk to him, but when he didn't engage, they moved on. He didn't trust anyone yet. He didn't even trust this whole arrangement. He kept expecting someone to come in and tell him he had to leave again. Then, one afternoon in the small room they called a library, really just a narrow closet with shelves and donated books, Michael found a tattered copy of the autobiography of Malcolm X. He sat on the floor, the book in his lap, and read for hours. He didn't speak to anyone that day, but the book opened something inside him. Here was a man who had been through pain, loss, rejection, rage, and had transformed it into something powerful. Michael read each page slowly, as though the words themselves carried warmth. He checked the book out and began reading every night in his bunk, the faint hallway light just enough to see by. Soon he returned to that small room day after day. He read Native Son, Man-Child in the Promised Land, The Souls of Black Folk. He read biographies of Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells. He moved on to history books, law basics, and eventually a dusty old copy of the Constitution of the United States, underlined in red ink by some long-forgotten hand. The staff began to notice. One of the youth workers, a man named Darius, started leaving books on the desk for him before he even asked. Darius was tall, heavy-set, and wore glasses that kept slipping down his nose. He didn't say much at first, just gave Michael nods and the occasional comment like, "That one's good," or "Hard read, but worth it." Michael nodded back, not sure how to respond, but it became a ritual. Every 2 or 3 days a new book would appear, and Michael would take it as a quiet challenge. Gradually, he began to open up, not in full conversations, but in questions. "Do you think someone like Malcolm could have been a lawyer?" he asked one evening while returning a book. Darius looked up, then leaned back in his chair. "Maybe, but he chose to fight his way." Michael nodded and thought about that, then asked, "What does it take to become one?" That was the beginning. Darius gave him a printed sheet of basic steps: high school diploma, bachelor's degree, LSAT, law school, bar exam. It looked impossible, but also real, a road however long. Michael pinned it above his bunk with tape. At school, he returned to classes through a partnership the shelter had with a local public high school. The first weeks were difficult. He was behind on everything. He barely spoke in class, but he turned in every assignment, every reading, every quiz. The teachers noticed. His social worker arranged tutoring twice a week, and he showed up without fail. One teacher, Mrs. Jordan, took special interest in him. She was stern but fair, and she praised his writing as sharp, direct, and brutally honest. She encouraged him to enter a citywide essay contest about justice. He didn't think he'd win, but he wrote it anyway. The essay was titled "Justice is for the Invisible Too." He came in second place. At the award ceremony, he wore a borrowed blazer 2 sizes too big and accepted a certificate in front of dozens of people. He didn't smile, but inside, something cracked open, like a window letting in fresh air. He wrote more after that: essays, letters, journal entries. He kept a notebook full of thoughts and observations, reflections on the law and fairness, about what it means to belong and be seen. He began to see patterns in the stories of others around him. So many kids at the shelter had been failed by the same systems: schools, families, courts. Some had records before they turned 13. Some had no records at all, just names no one remembered. Michael wrote their stories too, when they let him. One night, while flipping through a textbook on basic civil rights law, he paused on a sentence. "The law is not emotion, it is structure." He read it again, then again. He underlined it and wrote in the margin, "But what if the structure is wrong?" That question stayed with him. He began asking Darius and other staff more questions about cases, about systemic bias, about loopholes. They didn't always have answers, but they encouraged his curiosity. They told him about black lawyers and judges in the city, about scholarships and outreach programs. For the first time, Michael allowed himself to dream beyond the next week. He began planning, mapping out years, imagining a future where he was not only safe, but essential. The shelter became more than a roof. It became a launch pad. It wasn't perfect. There were fights, thefts, curfews, and occasional lockdowns. But it was a place where he was allowed to be more than a survivor. It was a place that saw him as a mind, not a mistake. When his 15th birthday came, he didn't tell anyone. But someone must have noticed the date on his file. That evening, a cupcake with a single candle was placed on his dinner tray. No one made a big deal of it. No singing, no speeches, just a cupcake and a nod from Darius across the room. Michael lit the candle, stared at it for a long time, then blew it out in silence. He didn't make a wish. He had already made a decision. He would become a lawyer, not for prestige, not for revenge, but for the boy he used to be, the one who sat freezing on a bus stop bench with a stolen granola bar and a heart full of ache. For every kid who had been told they were nothing, for every child who had no one to defend them, he would be the voice that once would have saved him. And so, with the weight of that promise in his chest, he opened a new book and began again. The years that followed were shaped not by comfort, but by discipline. Michael's life remained a steady climb through hardship, but the summit in his mind never blurred. He understood early on that no one was coming to hand him anything, and so he took hold of the only tool he trusted, his will. Every morning he woke with purpose. Every night he lay down with exhaustion and a growing sense of direction. The boy, who once froze on a bench with no idea what tomorrow might bring, was now a student, a reader, a planner. He was no longer surviving merely by instinct. He was building. High school was still a battlefield, but he had changed. Teachers no longer looked through him. They called on him. Some still watched with guarded expressions, doubting his sudden spark of excellence. But Michael didn't concern himself with winning affection. He wanted knowledge. He wanted mastery. He wanted to understand how the world worked and how it had been built to keep boys like him outside its gates. His days began early. He helped clean the shelter at dawn in exchange for extra tutoring hours. He attended school with quiet intensity, sitting in the front of every class, taking notes furiously, asking questions that sometimes startled his teachers. He stayed after the bell, seeking extra assignments, clarification, or just a few more minutes alone with a textbook. In the afternoons, he walked or caught buses to the public library downtown, where he spent hours reading in silence, often surrounded by college students who assumed he was one of them. At night, he returned to the shelter and read until his eyelids gave in. By 16, Michael had caught up to his grade level. By 17, he had surpassed it. He enrolled in advanced placement courses, aced his exams, and began corresponding with college advisors about financial aid and application requirements. His social worker helped him gather documents, write essays, and fill out every form with meticulous care. He applied to 12 universities. The waiting was excruciating. During this time, he began working part-time at a diner near Lake Street. It was a 24-hour place, open all night, frequented by everyone from exhausted students to drunken businessmen. Michael worked the late shifts, cleaning tables, washing dishes, and occasionally running the register. The manager, a stern woman named Colleen, didn't smile much but appreciated his silence and speed. "You don't complain. That's rare," she said once, handing him an extra piece of pie at the end of his shift. He used his paycheck sparingly, saving what he could. He bought his own used laptop, paid for his college application fees himself, and always kept cash tucked deep in his duffel bag, still the same one he had packed on that awful December night. It was ragged now, patched and worn, but it remained with him like a companion. He refused to part with it. When the first acceptance letter came, he didn't open it immediately. He sat on the steps outside the shelter with the envelope in his hands, heart pounding, breath visible in the cool spring air. He stared at his name on the front, Michael Elijah Brooks, and thought about how far that name had come. Finally, he tore it open. The University of Minnesota Law Scholars Program welcomed him with full tuition and a modest living stipend. He read the letter twice, then a third time, and then sat still for a long while, unable to cry, unable to smile, simply holding the paper against his chest as if to make sure it wouldn't disappear. The shelter staff celebrated in their own way. Darius shook his hand and clapped him on the back, his eyes briefly wet. Mrs. Jordan sent a card and a note that read, "You were always meant for this." Michael placed the letter and the card together in a folder he labeled Proof. It joined his growing archive of test scores, essays, and clipped articles about the failures of juvenile justice systems across the country. College began in late August. He moved into a small dorm room on campus, paid for by grants and scholarships. He had one suitcase, his duffel, and a crate of books. That was all. His roommate, a lanky boy from Duluth named Aaron, was friendly but talkative. Michael learned to smile politely and put in his headphones when he needed space. He wasn't there to socialize. He was there to prepare. The transition wasn't easy. The classes were harder, faster, more competitive. The professors didn't coddle anyone. Michael studied twice as much as his peers to stay afloat. He spent his weekends buried in research papers, rarely attending parties or campus events. He wasn't aloof. He was just committed. His classmates didn't understand, but they respected his tenacity. He continued working nights at the diner. The hours were brutal. He returned to his room near dawn, often too exhausted to speak. He'd collapse into bed for a few hours before dragging himself to morning lectures. His body ached constantly, but he never missed a shift, never asked for fewer hours, never used his past as an excuse. Still, there were moments of doubt. Nights when he stared at case law and couldn't focus. Days when he heard students casually joke about those kids from the system, and rage simmered beneath his calm exterior. He wanted to scream that he was one of those kids, that he'd bled and suffered and clawed his way into this room, but he said nothing. He turned the pain inward and transformed it into fuel. One winter, he took an elective course on constitutional law taught by an older black professor named Dr. Terrence Langley. The man was known for his sharp tongue and high expectations, but Michael thrived under his scrutiny. After class one day, Dr. Langley pulled him aside and said, "You're not just here to pass, are you?" Michael shook his head. The professor smiled slightly. "Good. This world needs more than passers." Dr. Langley became a mentor of sorts. He challenged Michael's assumptions, gave him reading lists that could drown lesser students, and invited him to sit in on community legal aid meetings. There, Michael saw law in action, not just in courts, but in housing disputes, custody battles, school expulsion hearings. He took notes furiously and began to understand how vast and flawed the system truly was. In his third year, Michael landed a coveted internship at a juvenile defense nonprofit. He worked under exhausted lawyers, juggling 20 cases at a time, most involving black and brown teens from underfunded schools and unstable homes. He met boys who reminded him of himself: sharp eyes, quiet voices, thin arms full of unspoken history. He wrote motions, organized files, even sat in on hearings. The work was draining, but it felt righteous. It felt necessary. He kept a journal during this time, documenting every case that struck him deeply. One entry described a 13-year-old arrested for defending his younger sister from a bully. Another detailed a 16-year-old accused of theft after taking food from a store when he hadn't eaten in 3 days. Michael saw in them the same desperate logic he once knew. He vowed to come back for them, not just these boys, but the countless others without names, without chances. Graduation came on a humid spring day. Michael crossed the stage in a borrowed cap and gown, accepting his degree with steady hands and a face that betrayed no emotion. But inside, something was breaking open, something vast and wordless. He had done it. Not just survived, but risen. Not just reached the door, but walked through it. He spent a year working full-time for the nonprofit, building experience, saving money. Then, at age 26, he opened his own law office on Hennepin Avenue. It was small, a single room above a bakery with a second-hand desk, 3 mismatched chairs, and a dented file cabinet. The sign on the door read, "Michael E. Brooks, Juvenile Defense Attorney." That was all. Clients came slowly at first. Mothers who had heard about him from other mothers. Teachers who wanted to save their students from suspension records. Kids who looked at him with cautious hope. He took every case he could. Sometimes they paid. Most times they couldn't. He never turned anyone away. His days were long, his nights longer. He wrote briefs until dawn, visited kids in holding centers, argued before judges with more credentials and less compassion. He was not flashy. He was relentless. Judges learned his name. So did public defenders, probation officers, social workers. He earned their respect not by shouting, but by never giving up. Every case was personal. Every verdict mattered. And each time he won, each time he kept a boy out of a cell or a girl from being expelled, he felt something settle inside him, a small piece of the boy he used to be, finally at peace. Michael had become the thing he once needed, and he had done it not in spite of his past, but because of it. He carried it with him into every courtroom, every conference room, every broken-down school office. It gave him strength. It gave him purpose. And though he never said it aloud, he knew. The cold had made him. The streets had carved him. The silence had taught him how to listen. And the dream, that stubborn, flickering dream born under snowflakes and sorrow, had never let him go. Michael had never cared for showmanship. His law office on Hennepin Avenue didn't need gleaming windows or a polished waiting room with coffee table magazines. It needed one working phone line, a decent printer, and a door that opened to people who had nowhere else to go. The rent was barely manageable, but it was his name, his practice, his mission. Above the desk, framed in simple black, hung the letter from the University of Minnesota confirming his law degree. Below it was a photo of the first boy he had ever helped stay in school, a quiet, anxious 14-year-old named Terrence who'd been falsely accused of fighting. The judge had dismissed the case. That photo, more than the degree, reminded Michael why he had chosen this path. The walls were thin, and the street noise often filtered in through the windows. Buses hissed, horns blared, conversations drifted upward like smoke. But in the small rectangle of space he had carved out for himself, there was calm. There was clarity. Files lined the shelves, all neatly labeled, many scuffed and overhandled, each one a story of a child pulled into the system before they ever had a chance to find their footing. Michael worked without assistance at first. He couldn't afford one. He answered the phones, scheduled appointments, prepared motions, and cleaned the floors. He worked late into the night, sometimes sleeping on the small futon in the back room, his laptop balanced on his knees. He ate takeout when he could, dollar menu sandwiches and reheated coffee. He kept his costs low, not out of pride, but necessity. What money came in often went right back out, toward filing fees for clients who couldn't pay, toward transportation for families who couldn't reach the courthouse. He specialized in the kinds of cases other lawyers avoided. Kids with no guardians to show up for them. Teens who'd been arrested for shoplifting food or missing school. Children written off as dangerous before they ever had a voice in their own lives. He saw them, not as numbers, not as problems, but as the same kind of boy he had once been. Frightened, quiet, buried under years of being told they were not worth the trouble. He took on cases pro bono more often than not. Mothers came in with their sons, eyes tired, voices desperate. Teachers sent troubled students his way, hoping someone might listen before it was too late. Some of the cases were heartbreaking, others infuriating. He met children who had been bounced through foster homes like packages, who flinched at kindness, who spoke with the weight of survival in their throats. He listened carefully to all of them. One afternoon, a grandmother arrived holding the hand of a small girl no older than 8. The girl had been suspended for threatening behavior after defending herself on the playground. Michael sat with her for over an hour, watching as her fingers tugged nervously at the hem of her jacket. Her voice was barely audible, but her words were steady. When they left, the grandmother clasped Michael's hand in both of hers and whispered, "You don't know what this means." But he did. Cases piled up. He found himself in court several times a week, arguing before judges who rarely looked past the charges on the docket. Michael became known not for fiery speeches or courtroom theatrics, but for his relentlessness. He showed up early. He submitted every form correctly. He never raised his voice, but his presence was commanding in its precision. He spoke like someone who had spent years studying the cracks in the system, and now knew how to navigate them. Over time, word spread. People talked about the young black lawyer who never turned anyone away. Community centers began referring parents to him. Former clients came back to thank him, sometimes years later, now with jobs or diplomas or children of their own. He listened to every story, filed every update in the same mental vault where he kept the memories of frozen sidewalks and hunger. Despite his growing reputation, Michael refused to expand too quickly. He hired a part-time assistant only when the paperwork began overtaking his evenings. A law student from his alma mater named Elaine came in 3 days a week to help file motions and manage intake calls. She was sharp, fast, and hungry to learn. Michael gave her the same advice Dr. Langley once gave him. Don't be here just to pass. Be here to change something. Elaine quickly learned that their work was never routine. One day, they were advocating for a teenager accused of truancy because he was caring for a disabled sibling, and the next, they were filing emergency guardianship paperwork for a child whose parents had disappeared. Michael coached her through every step, not as a professor, but as a fellow survivor of the system's indifference. His days were filled with stories, some hopeful, some tragic. One boy, Anthony, had been arrested for breaking into a grocery store. The prosecutor wanted to make an example of him. Michael learned that Anthony had been homeless for 3 months and had stolen nothing but food. He presented the case with calm precision, citing juvenile rehabilitation statutes, medical history, and a psychological assessment showing signs of PTSD. The charges were dropped. Michael found Anthony a temporary shelter and connected him with a mentor program. Months later, Anthony brought him a drawing he'd made, 2 hands lifting a child out of water. Michael framed it and hung it beside Terrence's photo. There were losses, too. Not every case could be won. Sometimes the judges didn't listen. Sometimes the system worked exactly as it was designed, to discard. Those nights were the hardest. Michael would sit alone in his office, staring at the files of children he couldn't save, their faces seared into his memory. He would reread their statements, his own notes, the case law that hadn't been enough. But he never allowed defeat to settle. In the morning, he returned to his desk and began again. The seasons passed, and Michael's office remained a constant. When winter came, he stocked a coat rack by the door with extra jackets he collected from donations. He bought snacks in bulk and placed them in a basket near the waiting chairs. No one left his office hungry. He knew what hunger did, not just to the stomach, but to the soul. Then, one February afternoon, as snow drifted gently past the window, the office door opened slowly. Michael looked up from a case file, expecting another walk-in client. Instead, two figures stood in the doorway. An older man and woman, both dressed modestly, their faces heavy with fatigue and age. The man's shoulders were slightly hunched, and the woman's hands trembled where they clutched her purse. Michael froze. The air in the room shifted. His pulse slowed, then quickened. He knew those faces. He had not seen them in over a decade, but time had merely softened the features, not erased the imprint. His parents. His father spoke first. His voice, once booming, now cracked and uncertain. "Michael," he said quietly, "we heard you. We didn't know where to start." The woman stepped forward, her lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. Her eyes shimmered with tears. She reached out a hand, hesitated, and lowered it again. Michael didn't rise from his chair. He watched them, his face unreadable. The years between them stretched out like a frozen river. He thought of snow on his shoulders, the echo of a slammed door, the silence that followed. He thought of the nights he had lain awake wondering why love had failed him, and how many times he had built himself back up from its absence. The man cleared his throat. "We were wrong," he said, voice cracking. "That night, I was angry, but I never meant—" Michael raised a hand, stopping him. There was no anger in his eyes, only distance. "You should go," he said softly. His mother's face crumpled. "Please, just let us explain. We've made mistakes, but we're still your—" Michael stood, calmly, deliberately. He walked to the door and held it open. "You were," he said, "but that ended the night you left me out in the cold." They stood frozen for a moment. His father's face reddened, his mother's tears finally falling. "I'm not angry," Michael continued. "I've made peace with the past, but I don't owe it a place in my present." The man took a small step forward, but Michael didn't move. Behind him, the photos on the wall watched silently. After a pause, his father nodded once, as if acknowledging a verdict he had long feared. His mother whispered, "We're sorry," and turned away. They left as quietly as they had come. Michael closed the door gently, then returned to his desk. Outside, snow began to fall heavier, blanketing the street below. He sat down, opened a file, and resumed his work. There was no ceremony to the moment, no drama, just a quiet closing of one chapter and the continuation of another. The boy they had thrown away had built a life without them, not out of spite, but necessity. Michael knew now that forgiveness didn't require reconciliation. It required release. And in that small office above a bakery, surrounded by the voices of children still fighting to be heard, he had already found everything he needed. In the days that followed the visit from his parents, Michael found himself returning to a place within his mind that he had long sealed off. Not a place of pain exactly, but one of deep silence, where memory lingered in quiet corners and the past waited patiently to be remembered. He did not speak to anyone about what had happened, not to Elaine, who noticed the subtle shift in his posture that evening, nor to Darius, who still met him for coffee once a month and could always tell when something was weighing on his shoulders. He simply continued working. The case files did not stop arriving. The phone still rang with urgency. The court calendars were still filled with the names of young people who had no one else standing beside them. Michael had taught himself early on that emotion could not be allowed to distract from purpose. But in the quiet moments, those brief, heavy pauses between tasks, he found his mind drifting back to the faces of the two people who had once shared a roof with him. He remembered the sound of his father's boots on the stairs, the way they had seemed so final the night he was cast out. He remembered the shape of his mother's eyes as she turned away in the kitchen, her silence louder than any shouted word. He remembered the cold, the way it had crawled under his clothes and into his bones, the way it had made him doubt that he was even human, even loved. Yet now, after all these years, they had stood in his office, older, diminished, desperate, and asked for forgiveness. But forgiveness, Michael knew, was not a currency to be exchanged. It was something far more private, something that belonged first to the one who had been harmed. And in the life he had built since that winter, he had long since done the hard work of forgiving, not for their sake, but for his own. Still, something lingered, a question without an answer. What had brought them back? Was it regret, loneliness, guilt, or had they simply needed something from him now that he had become someone of substance? One evening, long after the office had closed, Michael sat alone at his desk, the windows dark, the city humming beyond the glass. He pulled out an old notebook from his drawer, its edges frayed, the pages warped from years of being carried from shelter to shelter. Inside were pieces of himself, scrawled quotes, case numbers, reflections written in moments of hunger and hope. Near the back, he found a passage he had written at 16, the night he had first spoken aloud the words, "I will become a lawyer." It was barely legible, written in pencil, shaky and faint, but the determination in the words still rang clear. He had survived. He had studied. He had fought his way into a system that was never meant to include him. He had defended others not because it was profitable, but because it was necessary. He had kept every promise he had made to himself, even the ones made in the dark, shivering, alone. Now the people who had once erased him had returned, and Michael had chosen not to let them in. There had been no anger in his voice that day, no rage, just the quiet strength of a man who no longer sought approval or understanding. But that did not mean he was unmoved. Beneath his composure lay a tide of emotion, grief not for the parents he had lost, but for the child he had been, who had once stood on the porch with a duffel bag hoping for a miracle. In the days that followed, Michael found himself paying more attention to the children who came into his office. He looked at them not just as clients, but as mirrors of himself. He listened more deeply, noted the way their shoulders hunched when they spoke of their families, the way their voices lowered when they described being left behind. One girl, Janiyah, 13, had been caught stealing tampons and granola bars from a pharmacy. When asked why, she simply said, "No one at home buys that stuff for me." Her eyes were hard, but behind them Michael saw the same quiet ache he had once carried. He defended her fiercely, not because the charges were severe, but because the world had already decided she was not worth the effort. Another client, Marcus, 16, had been expelled after defending his younger brother from a gang member near the school entrance. The school board claimed zero tolerance for violence. Michael sat across from them at the hearing and asked, in a voice devoid of aggression but filled with pointed clarity, whether they had any tolerance for protection. Marcus was reinstated. His brother's principal later thanked Michael in a trembling voice. Each of these victories was more than a legal triumph. They were corrections to a narrative that had once written Michael off, and with each one, he felt the residue of his past shift further into the background. Still, on certain mornings, he walked past the block where he had once slept behind the subway vents. The city had changed. A new mural covered the wall near the station, vibrant and colorful. The benches had been replaced. The shelter where he had once stayed now had a renovated sign, though the building remained weathered by time. He paused there once, hands in the pockets of his coat, remembering the first night he had curled beneath that vent, the way the heat had felt like mercy. He looked at the mural, a portrait of a young girl with her arms outstretched, painted in bold strokes of yellow and blue, and wondered who she was meant to be. Perhaps someone like him. Perhaps someone who had survived. He turned and walked on. His office was waiting. His clients were waiting. A week after his parents' visit, Elaine brought in a new file. "You'll want to see this one," she said, placing it on his desk. "Kid's 15, arrested for sleeping in a closed park, said he doesn't have anywhere else to go." Michael opened the file and saw a name, a photo, and a charge sheet. The boy's eyes looked tired, too tired for 15. "I'll take it," Michael said. The boy arrived the next day, escorted by a caseworker who barely looked up from her phone. Michael offered him water and asked him to sit. He watched the boy's hands, how they clenched the chair arms, how his eyes darted to the floor. "What happened?" Michael asked gently. "They said I was trespassing," the boy replied, "but I wasn't hurting nobody. I just didn't have nowhere else." Michael nodded. "I know." The boy looked up, startled. "You do?" Michael leaned forward, his voice quiet. "Yes, I do." They talked for over an hour. By the end, the boy's shoulders had relaxed slightly. When he left, Michael promised he would handle the court date and make sure the charge wouldn't follow him. That night, Michael sat in the office long after the street lamps had come on. The cold outside reminded him of 100 nights long past. But inside, there was warmth, not just from the heater, but from the certainty that he had not wasted his pain. His parents had returned, hoping to reclaim a version of the son they had cast out. But the man they had met was someone forged from solitude, from rejection, from an unshakable belief that he was more than what they had once declared him to be. Michael had forgiven them long ago, but he had never forgotten. And now, each time he stood beside a child in court, each time he filled out a form or argued for a second chance, he was answering a deeper question, not just for them, but for himself. He was not the boy they had left behind. He was the man who stood because of it. Winter lingered longer that year. Snow clung stubbornly to rooftops and sidewalks well into March, as if the season itself refused to let go of the city's bones. From his window on Hennepin Avenue, Michael watched the snow fall gently against the glass, each flake settling briefly before melting into streaks that ran downward like transparent ink. Inside, the office was warm, the radiator humming softly, files stacked in careful piles around him. It was a quiet morning, and for a rare moment, there was no urgency pressing at his shoulders, no back-to-back appointments or last-minute court motions. He sat at his desk with the file open in front of him, but his eyes drifted to the window, his thoughts elsewhere. The boy he had met days ago, 15 years old, no home, no guardian, just a tattered backpack and a weary heart, had come back the next day. Not because he was required to, but because, as he put it, "This place didn't make me feel like trash." Michael had offered him a snack, a seat, and a plan. They'd filed to have his record sealed, petition for emergency housing, and begin the process of connecting him to a mentor through a youth legal support program Michael had helped design. The boy had nodded silently. At the end of the meeting, just before leaving, He had turned back and said, "I didn't know lawyers could be like you." Michael had simply replied, "They should be." That boy, James, had reminded Michael of too many others. Faces blurred by time, but never forgotten. Children who arrived at his door angry, silent, broken, or afraid. Some had been bounced through shelters and homes. Others had families who refused to speak their names. They came with different stories, but the same echo behind their eyes: abandonment. Michael had learned early in his practice that winning a case wasn't always enough. The real victory was in helping them see that they mattered, not just as legal entries or clients, but as people worthy of care and protection. It was a truth he had fought to accept for himself, and now he handed it to others, one child at a time. In the months since his parents had come and gone from his office, leaving nothing behind but a few footprints in the snow and the scent of old pain, Michael had not once doubted the choice he made. He did not regret closing the door. If anything, it had clarified something that had long been unresolved within him. He had found his place, and it was not beside them. The people who had once cast him out were not his family, not anymore. His real family had been built brick by brick, act by act, moment by moment. It was made up of the ones who stayed, who believed, who listened. People like Darius, who had placed a book on a library table without a word, knowing it would change his life. Like Mrs. Jordan, who had seen past his silence and challenged him to write. Like Elaine, who stood beside him now every day, organizing, assisting, holding the structure together. And it was made up of the children, those he had defended, those who had returned to thank him, and those who would never know his full story but would feel its shape in the way he looked them in the eye and said, "You are not alone." On the office wall, the photographs had grown in number. Not formal portraits, but snapshots taken with shaken hands and borrowed cameras. Smiling faces, candid moments, a graduation cap, a birthday cake with 5 candles, a little girl holding up a library card as if it were made of gold. Each photo told a story, and each story was a testament. That spring, Michael received a letter in the mail. It came in a plain white envelope with no return address, but the handwriting was familiar. Small, slightly slanted, with careful loops. It was from his mother. He hesitated before opening it, fingers brushing the seal with a distant kind of curiosity. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. The letter was brief. She wrote that she didn't expect forgiveness or contact. She wanted only to say that she had seen him once from a distance as he stood at a courthouse with a young boy. She had watched him smile, place a hand on the boy's shoulder, and speak to him with quiet strength. "You looked like someone who had become everything we could never be," she had written. "And I hope someday you'll know how proud I am, even if I don't deserve to say so." Michael folded the letter slowly and placed it in a drawer. He did not reply. There was nothing left to say. He did not hate her. He no longer needed anything from her. His life was full, not because it had been repaired, but because he had rebuilt it himself. A week later, he was sitting in the common room of a youth housing center he often partnered with. The kids there knew him well. He wasn't just a lawyer who showed up when someone got into trouble. He was the one who remembered birthdays, who brought books and board games, who helped them fill out college forms or draft letters to estranged siblings. That day, they were doing a workshop on storytelling, and Michael had been asked to share something personal. He stood at the front of the room, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the faces of the dozen or so teenagers slouched in plastic chairs. Some looked bored, some curious. A few leaned forward, notebooks open. "I'm going to tell you a story," he began. But it's not about law or school or even about winning. It's about what happens when the people who are supposed to love you don't. The room quieted, a few heads tilted. When I was 14, he continued, I got kicked out of my house. Not for something I did, but for who I was. I spent weeks on the street, sleeping wherever I could. I stole food. I got sick. I wanted to disappear, but I didn't. Someone found me, helped me, gave me a place to rest and a reason to believe I wasn't just a mistake. That's when everything started to change. He paused, watching as the weight of his words settled into the room. I didn't forgive them right away, and I didn't go back. But I made something else. I made a life, and I found people who became my family, not by blood, but by staying. Silence followed, not heavy, but deep. One of the girls in the front row raised her hand, her eyes wet. "How did you know you'd make it?" she asked. "I didn't," Michael said, "but I refused to believe that being thrown away was the end of my story." Later that evening, as he walked back to his office, the sky streaked pink and gold above the city. The snow had finally melted, revealing sidewalks dotted with new sprouts and fallen leaves from seasons past. The air smelled of earth and renewal. He paused at a corner, watching a group of kids skateboard past, their laughter ringing clear. He smiled. Back at the office, he placed a new photo on the wall. It was of James, holding up a certificate of placement in a new group home. In the boy's other hand was a paperback novel, the autobiography of Malcolm X. Michael had given it to him himself. He sat down at his desk and opened a new file. Another name, another chance, another life beginning. Outside, the city moved forward, unaware of the quiet revolution happening one case at a time. But within those four walls, under flickering fluorescent lights, and beside a wall of faces that refused to be forgotten, Michael knew the truth that had carried him through every cold night and every silent morning. Family is not the people who share your name. It's the ones who don't leave. And in that sense, Michael had a family larger and stronger than he ever could have imagined, and he would never let them down. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos for powerful true life stories, and feel free to share this one with someone who needs to hear it.